To be the Defence Secretary who deploys British troops to Ukraine because that would mean this war will finally end?
That's a very, very interesting question. Whenever we describe nuclear weapons and we talk of tactical nuclear weapons, to look at those countries that are continuing to support Russia and start to put economic pressure on them.
Today is February 23, 2026, and tomorrow marks exactly 4 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I am delighted to welcome to our studio a great friend and supporter of Ukraine, Philip Ingram, former colonel in British military intelligence, member of the Order of British Empire, and host of the Frontline on Times Radio. Thank you for joining our program, Philip.
My pleasure to be with you.
I want to be the Defence Secretary who deploys British troops to Ukraine because that would mean this war will finally end. UK Defence Secretary John Healey, could you tell us what this signals for Ukraine from the United Kingdom, and do you think such a prediction could come true?
I think the prediction of sending British troops to deploy in Ukraine, along with other international troops, could come true, and could come true very quickly indeed. Unfortunately, I don't think it is something that would end the war. But it would send a very, very clear message to Vladimir Putin that the Ukraine is not alone. That message is being put out through diplomatic channels and everything else, but there's nothing better than troops on the ground. Those troops, I don't think, would be engaged in combat operations, but would certainly be able to provide additional support to Ukrainian preparations for combat actions elsewhere. And it's the political message that would send across that would be huge. Putin keeps saying that he would respond and see those troops as legitimate targets. I don't think he would. Every time he has been given a red line, as he would describe it, and that red line has been crossed, he hasn't responded. And he's always just changed his mind and gone away off and done something else.
Regarding nuclear deterrence by Russia's allies, you mentioned that using tactical nuclear weapons would be a strategic disaster for Putin, as countries like China and India would instantly turn away. Question, in your view, are there any other red lines for Beijing and New Delhi besides nuclear weapons, such as certain conventional war crimes or environmental catastrophes, that could make them withdraw support from the Russian economy?
That's a very, very interesting question. Whenever we describe nuclear weapons and we talk of tactical nuclear weapons, and intermediate range and then strategic missiles, this is all down to the different treaties that trying to control the numbers of weapons, and there were no control over the tactical level. And it all talks about the military effect on the battlefield. But there's not just a military effect, there's not just a tactical effect, there's also an operational level and a strategic effect. And any use of a weapon of mass destruction, whether it be falls into the tactical, intermediate or strategic brackets, matters not. It would have a strategic impact from a political perspective. And other weapons that would do that, if we started to see the use of chemical weapons in a way, and I know there have been chemical weapons used by the Russians on the front line, but most of those have been irritant or choking agents that don't really fall into the classic categories that people look at. But if we started to see the use of nerve agents or some of the old First World War agents like chlorine or mustard gas being used on the front lines, then that again I think would be a political red line that China and India and other countries would step back from. Environmentally, I think if we started to see deliberate attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant or other nuclear power plants potentially causing the release of nuclear material or radiological material into the atmosphere that could spread around the world and affect things, again would increase the pressure that other countries would put on Russia. But I think that's probably the limit of what would put pressure on. I think the important thing now for the West to do is to look at those countries that are continuing to support Russia and start to put economic pressure on them for them continuing their support in the same way that we've seen with the Russian Shadow Fleet tankers that are going around the world. We've suddenly seen they're having difficulty in offloading their oil and other products into China, into India, into Turkey, because of the nervousness of those governments are getting economic sanctions put against them for taking that. That will have a much bigger effect and hopefully help them reduce, if not stop, their support for Russia. But I think it'll take quite some time and an awful lot more hardline diplomatic action from Western countries and other countries to put that economic pressure. I'm not saying anything more than little what we describe as green shoots of pressure. I'm not saying that real intense pressure being put on just yet, but I think it could come.
On differences in intelligence work, you described the difference between the British approach to intelligence analysis, time for a cup of tea, versus the American tendency for immediate reactions, scrambling bombers over a single intercepted conversation. Question is, how does this institutional mentality difference affect coordination among NATO allies, especially when rapid joint decisions are needed to provide intelligence support to Ukraine?
Yes, that's a fascinating question. I could talk about that all night on operations. I've coordinated the intelligence support coming in from lots of different nations, and it's critical to understand how each nation works, and that takes building up a human relationship with the head of intelligence from those different organizations, and then understanding the doctrine as to how they apply things. And then whenever you see intelligence that's coming to you, knowing who it's come from, knowing the way that it's gathered and the way that that particular nation operates, then you can make an assessment as to how you need to react, whether you need to call them and say, are you serious? Is this true? Do you need to use your own mechanisms to verify it? Or what your actions will be? And this is where the Americans are in a very fortunate position. They have got the assets to be able to react immediately. If they see something that, if they even think it's a threat, they have got the assets to deploy and start to prepare and be ready and be at the forefront if it's there. And if whenever the intelligence is re-examined again, the conversation they've intercepted is reinterpreted, and they find that no, it's not quite a threat. It was people coming out with a slightly more innocent conversation. They've still got the ability to withdraw those assets. Most other nations don't have that luxury, and that's why whenever we make the decision to deploy a capability, we have to be certain that there's a necessity for that to happen. And that's why I describe the soak time, to have a cup of tea, because I was referring particularly to signals intelligence intercepts, and 9 times out of 10, in fact probably nearer 999 times out of 1,000, the interpreter that does the initial listening and writes out their initial tipper report saying this conversation has got it wrong. They've got the nuances wrong, and therefore it's much better if it doesn't fit with other intelligence, if it feels slightly out of sync with what else is going on. That's the time that I have my soak time, and I go and make a cup of tea, sit down and have a cup of tea and re-look at it again, and usually you find out nothing nasty has happened, and then the check of that translation has come in. You find that it does mean something different. But again, this is having a good, clear basis of an intelligence picture from all sources. So that something looks not quite right and feels not quite right, then it probably isn't right. But you have to have that basis, and you have to have that professional understanding of where everything's going. So that's where the real work comes in.
In your recent interview, you shared horrifying facts that due to poor medical care, Russians with severe injuries mostly die from sepsis or return to the front
Yeah.
on crutches. Given this level of medical collapse, do you see signs that it is systematically eroding the willingness to fight among new conscripts? Or does fear of repression for desertion still outweigh fear of death from injury?
Again, another fascinating question, because this ties in with what we describe in British doctrine as the moral component of fighting power. And you can see the Ukrainians applying that fantastically well when it comes to supporting Ukrainian troops. The medical support that's there, the ability to, even if it's virtually impossible for people to get forward to extract a casualty, to give the casualty what they need to almost treat themselves by drone and elsewhere, the priority that's put into that is fantastic. And that gives confidence to the troops that they will be looked after. And you see, unfortunately, the large numbers of men and women that have lost limbs that are around in normal society across Ukraine shows that people are being extracted from the front line. They are being successfully treated and they're being kept alive. And unfortunately, all of the recent conflicts have shown that even with some horrific injuries, you can still have a quality of life back again. And again, seeing people getting back to their loved ones gives that moral component, the justification that comes from the families, the people, the soldiers, the men and women that are on the front line. The Russians don't have that. And therefore, the only thing that is keeping them on the front line is fear. And it is that fear of being put into the meat grinder waves that we hear about, being pushed into the wave after wave after wave of attacks. We hear of the extortion that there is for people to try and avoid going the front line, and the tens of thousands of dollars it costs them to get away from it. We see the pictures and the videos of Russian troops being tied to trees in freezing cold conditions, or put in pits and not given food or treatment for injuries. And we don't see any successful videos of Russian frontline medical facilities that are helping to extract troops who get injured, to treat them and then get them into additional hospital treatment. So it's very lucky if injured Russian soldiers actually manage to make it back to their families again. And that will impact their families to a degree, but because Russia controls the information domain so tightly, it's not having the impact that it did, say, whenever the Russian mothers forced the Russians to withdraw from Afghanistan many years ago. We're not seeing that same understanding in amongst the Russian people of the impact that is happening in the front line, but it's certainly impacting the morale. And that impact on the morale is making it more difficult for the commanders to get people to go and carry out military operations, and therefore the commanders are having to dream up different ways, and most of them tend to be aggressive and they tend to be violent. That again undermines the moral component even more. So it's a vicious circle that they've got themselves into that does not lead to good military outcomes. I would not want to be on the front line with the Russians in any way, shape or form. It's a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, it's a disaster that's happening at the moment. And that is why it's being reflected in the casualty numbers. 32 to 33,000 a month, over 1,000 a day. And the majority of that 1,000 are ending up dead. That is shocking statistics. And it should be unsustainable.
Actually, I think fascinating question and insightful and very deep and very interesting answer is the greatest couple and zoo of weapons. You correctly pointed out that European countries could overload the Ukrainian army by providing too many different missile systems, each requiring unique logistics, maintenance and guidance methods. Has this logistical nightmare which we now see in Ukraine caused NATO leadership to rethink its approach to standardization and interoperability of weapons for future potential conflicts.
Again, another fascinating question. And yes, there's no point in giving people weapons unless you know how to maintain them, how to fight with them, not just operate them, and fight with them together. So, in the modern battlefield, you see the use of drones and helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft supporting artillery and mortars and missiles being used, supporting direct fire weapons on tanks, on armoured personnel carriers, and direct fire weapons from infantry troops on the ground. And unless you can work them all together, you're not making best and optimal use of it. And that takes an awful lot of practice. And the more different systems you've got, and the more that have got different natures of ammunition or different ways of operating. They are manufactured by different companies, the greater the complexity. And that complexity is magnified 10, 20, 100-fold by the logistic chains that are needed to bring all the spare parts in. And that, again, causes military difficulties that do not help on the battlefield and help get decisions. They just overly complicated it. Will it make NATO any more efficient? NATO's all about standardization. That's the primary goal for NATO, and that's why it's got a number of documents called STANAGs, which are standardization documents, and that's so that if someone turns up on the front line and needs to plug their device in, they don't come up to a European 2-pin plug with a British 3-pin plug. The standardizations have been worked out beforehand. It doesn't always work that well in practice, because when it comes to defence and defence contracts being let and everything else, then there tends to be a very nationalistic approach to it. So the French will always buy from French companies. The Germans will always want to try and buy as much from German companies as possible. The Americans will want to try and sell their weapons to anyone that they can possibly get to buy them. But then they turn around, as we heard Donald Trump say, we only give you the second best and we'll hold and restrict the use of some of the weapons. And the British like to build their own bespoke weapon systems that are overly complicated, and I describe as gold-plated, diamond-encrusted to such an extent where they may not be as reliable in every way as possible, as we've seen with the Challenger 2 tanks that have been given to Ukraine. They're brilliant weapon systems, but exceptionally complex to operate, take a huge training burden and a huge logistic burden to support them. Add all that together and it's a very complex soup of things. And this is why what NATO then concentrates on is being able to operate together from a doctrinal perspective, get our tactics the same, get our thinking the same, get our command and control the same, get our planning the same, get our understanding of intelligence, at least the understanding the same, so that we can bring in intelligence from different nations and utilize it to the best way, get our targeting methodologies the same, so that no matter what system you're using, it doesn't really matter. And each nation will know how to use its own system. This is where Ukraine is in a difficult position, because it's trying to learn how to use every nation's systems that are out there, as well as developing its own. And Ukraine is developing some fantastic weapon systems that it's using to good effect. And it is being helped by European and other NATO nations to do so, as well as build on the real innovation that exists inside Ukraine. And the interesting thing that I find is some of that learning is then coming out of Ukraine and going back into European nations, and is helping NATO nations get better, in particular the use of drones and other unmanned and uncrewed weapon systems.